Okay, it's time to start. Today we have a lecture titled Uncover Your Message by me, Natsuyo no Moto. So everyone, please use the approve stamps. Okay, thank you very much. So, Moto-san, please start your lecture.
えはい、皆さんおはようございます。野本夏代です。今日は異文化コミュニケーションのお話をしたいと思います。Wait,
あ、
what?
ただ、これ、
Only half
ですね。Okay, thank you
only
very
half
much.
of you understood what I just said? Okay, now I switched to English. So does everyone understand me now? We
Yeah, English,
wish.
please.
We wish. In a cross-cultural situation, just because the same language is spoken doesn't mean that your message is clearly heard. The number one thing that stands between you and your culturally diverse audience is common sense. Over the years, we built up our own layers of assumptions. Our values may be influenced by our family, friends, colleagues, or the society we live in. And this is how we look at the world. This becomes our common sense. So one day, I was sitting in a meeting with my client. Half the people were Japanese, and the other half German. Someone proposed an ambitious plan. A Japanese said, "That's difficult." A German said, "That's difficult." Translation: German: "That's difficult. I love difficult. Let's challenge ourselves." Japanese: Translation: "That's difficult for us to do. We must consider different scenarios so we won't fail. So for now, I'm rejecting your proposal, but I don't want to be rude or disturb the harmony of our team. So I'm saying no in a very indirect way. Please read between the lines." What stood between them is these classes. In a cross-cultural situation, your common sense may not be so common. We need to remove these layers of common sense, assumptions, unwritten rules, our ways of how things are done, and start communicating effectively beyond our differences. So today, you will receive the three-step process that I call the 3 A's, so that you can present your ideas effectively and persuasively, globally, and locally. And the first A is acknowledge. There you go. So to start, let's talk about culture. How do you describe culture, right? It's a vague idea. Let's say you're invited as a teacher of the day at fifth graders class, and you are to explain what culture is and draw a picture of what you think would best describe culture. What would you draw? So type in the chat what you're going to draw to explain culture. For example, you can say world map, something like that. So world map is out because I said it already. So type in the chat what you would draw. Let's see. And I'm looking at the chat in the other computer. Anyone? Any takers? Flag, local customs, people, flags, food, flags, circle. That's interesting. Huh. If you said circle, can you explain what that means in the chat? Wig, music, language, diversity, thinking, friends. Oh my gosh. Network, food, drinks. Oh, you all love food. Ah, road and traffic situation. Oh, that's very interesting. Huh. And more coming in. Shared likes. Joke. So some of these ideas are um, more like something you can see or you can experience, but some ideas are more about internal things, the way we do things. Yeah, something you can't see, right? Yeah, thank you. As all the ideas are coming in, well, let's talk about what uh, most people or in the famous cross-cultural field, how they are described. So in the cross-cultural field, culture is often described as an iceberg. It's interesting that no one said iceberg, but someone said circle, and I wanna know what that means. So let's say you're sitting on a boat looking at it. Can you see the entire figure all the way to the bottom? No, you can only see the tip of the iceberg, right? But there is a much, much larger piece hiding under the surface that's supporting the tip of the iceberg. And that's what the culture looks like. You can see what they look like and hear what they say, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. Why they say what they say and why they do what they do are all hiding under the surface. And you could call it a deadly Titanic moment if you don't know what's hiding under the surface. Even between people you think would share the same culture. So let me take you back to 2005. Soon after I started my own strategy consulting firm in New York, I was hired by Mr. K, a 65-year-old former Japanese government official who's now the chairman of this 4-century-old Japanese craft company. And they used to make samurai swords, a little bigger than that. Well, Mr. K had his strategy all laid out, but he wanted to make sure that his strategy is going to work in the US. So one day he called me over and said, "You're hired." Just like that? Sounds good to me. By that time, I had been in the US for 10 years already. I became American enough to understand how things work over here, and yet Japanese enough to understand how things work over there. Little did I know that I still needed to learn how to bridge our differences. Have you ever made a small communication mistake and you didn't know you did, and lost something bigger? Me too. As soon as Mr. K hired me, I conducted extensive research and analysis, as I always do as a strategy consultant. Then I said to myself, uh-oh, his strategy is not going to work. And I have to tell him that. Well, if I explain the strategy in detail, he'll understand. No problem. Problem. I put together a very detailed presentation explaining why his strategy is not going to work and why mine would. Oh, it was very logical. No room for argument. I was so confident that Mr. K would thank me. So I attached my masterpiece presentation in email, put Mr. K in the recipients field, and CC'd everybody. Click. Now, what do you think happened? The next day, I received the shortest email from Mr. K. Just 2 words. Call me. I said 2 words to myself. Oh, yeah, he must love my strategy. So I called him right away. Then he gave me another 2 words. Come today. Now, if you came with me later that day, you would have seen Mr. K sitting behind this antique desk. On the wall hung this beautiful shining samurai sword above his shining bald head. Wow, magnificent. I mean, the sword. His voice cuts through the air. Who do you think you are? I said, I'm your consultant. You hired me. Who do you think you are? In my head. But instead I said, well, it seems like you need a little more explanation. Let me explain. According to the research, and then he gave me 2 more words that I never forget. You're fired. In just a few months, I went from you're hired to you're fired. What happened? Thinking back, Mr. K kept giving me 2 words, right? You're hired, call me, come today, you're fired. That's what I heard. But it was only the tip of the iceberg. I was completely misconstrued what I thought. Why? Because I didn't know there was more hiding under the surface. So why did he say what he said? So let me pull up the slide one more time, if I can. So if you recall, there was an iceberg, right? Let's pull that up. Can everyone see it? Okay. So Mr. K, was probably thinking, you're hired because I need you to reassure my team that my strategy is correct. And call me and come today because we need to talk privately about what you did wrong. And you're fired. Well, I got that one. You know that one too. But he was probably thinking, you embarrassed me in front of my team. You don't know your place. You are disrespectful. You're fired. That's the why. The rest of the iceberg I totally missed to see. In a cross-cultural situation, we face differences in values, opinions, or communication styles. And yet, we often apply our own familiar why to judge what we see or hear. But this would cause a huge misunderstanding, miscommunication, and mistrust. Now, here's a myth about cross-culture. We tend to think that cross-culture is about country and country differences. Some people wrote in the chat earlier that the differences will be the flags or food or people, clothing, right? If it's a country and country differences, that's a myth. Well, think about it. A huge communication mistake happened between a Japanese and a Japanese, right? At the end of the day, we all have different values, opinions, perspectives, communication styles, and we form our own unique culture. And I call it the culture of one. Culture of one. We're like this onion. Well, I would think that there's a sexier way to say it, but it's like an onion layered with influences from many different sources, like family, friends, colleagues, society we live in. And we, at each layer, these experiences, our own experiences, shape our values and perspectives, right? And the culture of one is you as layers of onions. And learning about the national level of cultural differences or the outer layer of the onion is like only looking at what it looks like from outside, right? It's a red onion, yellow onion, white onion, etc. But the sweetest part of the onion is the core. But don't get me wrong, the national culture does play an important role, and it's helpful to have that knowledge. But it's just a foot in the door. To really deeply understand someone and to break through a cultural barrier, we can't stop at the national level or the outer layer of the onion. Each person is uniquely shaped by their individual blend of different layers. So if we stop at the cultural norms, it only creates what I call sophisticated stereotypes, and it'll lead to divisions. And these divisions are happening all over the world, right? So we must peel back these layers to uncover the core and acknowledge the complexity and individuality hiding under the surface. Now, here's a challenge for you. How open-minded are you to acknowledge that your common sense may not be so common? So the first and the most important step of the 3 A's is to acknowledge that we all have different culture of one. Second step is analyze, digging deeper into the part of the iceberg that you can't see so that you can communicate effectively. Now, let me introduce you to one of the famous cross-cultural models. It's called High Context, Low Context by Edward Hall. Now, there are several cross-cultural models out there, and you may have heard of this high context, low context model, and you may also have heard of Hofstede model or Erin Meyer's the culture map, right? I'm choosing high context, low context model because I think it's most relevant in explaining the gaps in cross-cultural communication. So we're talking about communication here. Now, according to this American anthropologist, Edward Hall, our communication styles are categorized into two types: high context and low context, or culture of verbal messages and culture of inferences. Now, in a high context culture, they rely on context. It is not necessary or even inappropriate to spell everything out explicitly. So a listener knows to read between the lines, and that's the context hiding under the surface. In Japanese, we say 空気を読む or read the atmosphere. So high context people read the atmosphere, make inferences to understand what it really means, so that the relationship, harmony, power balance, and a sense of security are all maintained within the group. In a low context culture, they rely on verbal messages. There's no room for inferences. They're more explicit, logical, and direct. So that means tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you have told them. And low context people also tend to focus more on individual excellence rather than group harmony. And I call this I focused as opposed to we focused. And this is what typically happens between very high context and very low context people. A low context person would be thinking, why don't you just say what you mean? If you meant differently, you should have verbalized it. I would. So if there is any misunderstanding, that's not my fault. Why didn't you say it? And they may tell you that straight to your face. But a high context person might be thinking, why do I have to spell everything out? Get the nuances and understand what it really means. Read the atmosphere and don't make me say it. And this context is all hiding under the surface. In a cross-cultural situation, when you only see the tip of the iceberg and don't think twice about what might be hiding under the surface, you could cause a deadly Titanic moment, like me with Mr. K. Remember, Mr. K kept telling me two words, right? Call me, come today, you're hired, you're fired. His communication style heavily relied on context, which makes him very high context. There was a huge room for interpretation. But he thought he conveyed his message clearly, and you would have interpreted him correctly if you shared the same context. If that's the case, high context communication works quite effectively because you don't have to say much and they'll understand you. But what about me? I applied my own assumptions, added my own interpretation, a wrong one, and thought, he couldn't wait to hear what I had to say. What does that make me? A low context. I took his words at the face value. And I communicated my strategy in such details against Mr. K's plan. I spelled everything out very logically, clearly, and explicitly. On top of that, I shared the information with everybody to be super transparent. I treated everyone equally. Very low context. Now you understand why I got fired from Mr. K. My very low context communication was quite rude from his high context point of view. As we say in Japanese, I stepped on his face. When you analyze your communication gap using this model, here are two important things you want to remember. One, the culture of one. Remember, every one of us has our own unique culture, and you can't stereotype people by their ethnicity or the country they're from. But that being said, it is still quite helpful to know their tendencies and use this tool to not judge them by their countries, but to analyze each person in each situation. And number two, this analysis is only relative. We can't always label ourselves as I'm low context or I'm high context. Yes, there is a tendency, but depending on who you're talking to in what situation, we could shift on this scale because we're not static, right? So for example, you may consider yourself to be relatively low context, but if the other person is even lower context than you, then you're perceived to be higher context from this person's point of view, right? So it's all relative. So it's important that you analyze a situation every time. When you analyze yourself and others using the same scale, you can gauge the gap. And this will help you to learn how and how much to adapt your message so you can meet the other person where they are. So that's the third step, adapt. So how do we adapt our communication when we identify a gap? So let's go back to Mr. K. If we were to go back in time, what could I have done differently? So when you're working with lower context people than you, your strategy is pretty straightforward. Be as transparent, clear, and specific as possible. If you're not sure whether your idea was understood, then feel free to ask, am I clear enough? Or what part of what I said did you not understand? And they'll be happy to tell you. But when you're working with higher context people than you, it may take a little more practice. Mr. K was very high context and me, very low context, right? We had a huge gap. So what could I have done? Well, I could have improved in two areas. One-on-one with him and presentation to his team. I'm calling it one-to-many communication. So first, one-on-one communication. The communication is not just about speaking, but also about listening, right? It's two-way communication. And especially with high context people, they have a lot more information in the part of the iceberg you can't really see. So it becomes an important skill to learn to listen to what is being said and what is being meant. Not just the words, but what's behind that words. That's the most important part. And the key to doing that is to ask good questions. So now, what are good questions? That's a good question to start. So people say there are no stupid questions. Well, that's correct. But most people don't know that questions can be categorized into 4 different types. The vertical axis measures the level of willingness to respond to such question. And the horizontal axis measures the level of learning or insights. First, light questions. Light questions break the ice. Questions like, how was your weekend? Or what sports do you like? They're getting to know you questions, and they improve relationships. And people are willing to answer these questions, but there is not much learning or insights from answering these questions. The second is bad questions. Bad questions freeze the ice. Questions like, aren't you getting married? Or when are you having a baby? You've heard that, right? None of your business. These questions don't consider relationships, and they often have negative tones or push their own agenda. And so people are not willing to answer, or there is no learning. Heavy questions. Heavy questions are like, why do you keep making the same mistakes over and over? Wow, hurts, right? It's heavy. People are not willing to answer heavy questions. They hurt. But if they do answer the question, they might give you some good learnings and insights. But when you use heavy questions, you have to first establish a relationship and trusting relationship and share a purpose. Then the heavy questions may become quite effective. So unlike these previous three types of questions, people are willing to answer good questions and they give you learnings. And good questions allow them to think differently, dig deeper into themselves, look for answers within, and volunteer the information. Think differently, dig deeper, look for answers within, and volunteer the information. So these questions, good questions, can give you deep learnings for both parties, the asker and the answerer. And good questions bring out not just hidden information, but quality information because they have to think. So that's the key to effective two-way communication. So when you enhance like questions by adding the level of insights or learning, it becomes good questions. And if you improve heavy questions by improving the willingness to respond, you can turn them into good questions. So let's look into good questions a little bit further. Good questions come from a blind spot. If you ask questions that they're always thinking about or asking themselves, there's no learning there. But if you ask a question that they have no idea about or not even interested, you're still not going to get anywhere. But the good question is in the vicinity of what's always in their mind, but they haven't really thought about it from that angle you're giving. And that's a blind spot. And good questions uncover that blind spot. So let's go back to Mr. K. If I had asked good questions to Mr. K, the outcome might have been different. Good questions like, what resources do you have in Japan that we can use in the US or we cannot? Or what could be the possible bottlenecks we have to overcome in the US? Now, notice that these questions came in an open-ended format, not a yes-no closed-ended format. Especially with high context people, open-ended questions work especially well because they would otherwise not speak up and information will stay hidden in the iceberg. But that is not because they're hiding the information, but it's just the way they communicate. It's their style. They need permission and sense of security to speak up and voice their opinions. Now, here's an important tip when you ask a good question. Consider high context and low context, and adapt the way you ask good questions. Mr. K was very high context and I very low context, right? So if I were to ask good questions to Mr. K, I would adapt my low context way to high context way so that I'm more inclusive, we-focused, and indirect. So this is what I would do. So watch carefully what I say. Mr. K, your strategy is very effective in Japan. I wonder what bottlenecks we might have to overcome in the US. What expertise can we learn from you? Now, what have you noticed that I just did? What have you noticed? Write in the chat something you noticed. Let's see. So what was I doing? So I was trying to adapt my low context way to high context way. What did I do? Oh, my chat just disappeared. Oh, there it is. Praise first. Yeah, made him feel comfortable, right? Careful wording and asking instead of telling. Yes, asking. I was asking good questions. And request to apply known info in a different scenario. Yeah, so I was urging him to apply his own experience, knowledge, information, so that he feels like he came up with the idea, right? And positive, yes, thank you. And have you also noticed the open-ended format? And also, I looked away and I was thinking to myself, or I was pretending that I was thinking to myself. So that for high context people, direct eye contact would be a little offensive or intrusion of a space, personal space. So I looked away as if I'm pondering on my thoughts. And then I came back to it, right? So those are what I did to adapt my my communication. So with these adapted good questions, Mr. K would have felt well respected and encouraged to think differently, and dig deeper into themselves, look for answers within, and provide his own opinion. As if a great idea just popped up in his head miraculously, but you actually influenced him with good questioning technique. As a result, he's happy, I'm happy, Titanic moment avoided. So let me share the screen back again. Here you go. Takes a little time. All right, so that's the first area that I could have improved. That was one-to-one communication. Now, one-to-many communication or presentation. When I presented my strategy to Mr. K's team, my communication was pretty logical, direct, and succinct. And if you want to convince your audience, clear logic is a must. But no matter how logically sound your message is, logic alone is not going to invite them to take action. You need an emotional connection. So you need both, right? Both logic and emotion. A little slow on my computer. Yep, logic and emotion. You need both. So let's take a look at both. First, logic. Have you ever listened to a speech or presentation and thought, how did he come to that conclusion? Or what's the point she's trying to make? That's interesting, but I'm fine with my same old way. In all of these cases, the speaker probably suffered from a lack of logic. And this person could be you. If you're not paying attention, close attention to your logic, then it's extremely easy to compromise on your logic. So in order to avoid, first, you need to have one most important message you want your audience to take away. And I call it one big message. Then you need main points to back up your one big message. Now, the relationship between this one big message and main points is key to building logic. And there are two very simple and yet very important questions I learned at McKinsey. Good questions. So what and why so? So the first question, so what, clarifies the logical connection between your one big message and each of your main points. Your main points are the facts, data, stats, research findings, statements that you're going to use to back up your one big message. So here's one main point. Therefore, what? So by asking so what or so they can what, you can check whether your main point logically explains your one big message. So look at the arrow pointing upward, this way, right? Upward from main points to one big message, bottom up. You have main point number 1. So what? One big message. You have main point number 2. So what? One big message. You have main point number 3. So what? One big message. Now, why so goes in the other direction, from one big message to main point, downwards. So your overall message is your one big message. Why did you come to such a conclusion? In other words, why so? Check the logical connection again between one big message and each main point, but this time top down. So here's one big message. Why so? Because main point number 1. Here's one big message. Why so? Because main point number 2. Well, you get the point. One big message, point number 3. When you do a so what, why so check between your one big message and each one of your main point, you have a clear logical structure. And this structure is called the pyramid structure because it looks like a pyramid. And if you find any leap or overlook or some gap, or if you start to go off track, go back to your messages and do so what, why so check. Then you may need to tweak them. And that way, you're going to have a solid logical structure. So no matter how logically sound your messages, logic alone is not going to invite them to take actions. You need emotional connections. So have you said to yourself, she's absolutely right, but I'm not getting it, or I'm not feeling it. I don't buy that, right? As a speaker, you want to emotionally connect with the audience and influence them, to positively influence them. So that's your goal of presentation. How do you do that? Stories. Through what I call the 6 C's of strategic storytelling. The 6 C's is based on the 3-act structure, and it's often used in screenplay writing, like movies. Act 1 is a setup. It's used for exposition and to establish the main characters, their relationships, and the world they live in or their circumstance. And Act 2 is confrontation. Some conflict happens to the main character and confronts the main character. And he or she, you can call him or she hero. Hero tries to resolve the conflict only to find themselves in ever worsening situations. So the conflict escalates. And then finally, they learn some new skills or come to a revelation from someone or something or some incident. And that's what I call cure. And Act 3 is resolution. The main character experiences some change, positive change usually, with a new sense of who they really are. And the story ends with a carry out or your one big message. Well, after all, the only purpose of telling a story is to deliver your one big message. A storytelling without a point or clear one big message is just rambling. So when you go to a movie next time, think about how the plot is structured. I'm pretty sure that every movie follows this 3-act structure. And if you can identify all these 6 C's in the movies, that'll be a good exercise. And business stories go, business storytelling goes the same way. However, there is a big difference. The next step. In films and other forms of entertainment, the main goal is to leave the audience with some kind of feelings, right? But afterwards, the audience will go back to their own lives, do their own things in their own ways. In business, our main goal is to leave the audience with motivation to take specific action. Business stories have to lead the audience to the next step. So before you start building your story, first make sure that you have a strong one big message, and then clarify the specific next step you want your audience to take. Then follow the 6 C's of strategic storytelling. Now today we explore the 3-step process called the 3 A's. Your message will be not only heard, but acted upon even in a culturally diverse audience. If you learn to acknowledge the iceberg, analyze the gap, and adapt your approach. And what I did not tell you yet is that there is a final A that completes the set. And it builds a firm foundation to exercise the 3 A's with maximum result. But before I reveal the last A, let me take a couple of questions. You can type in the chat if you have any questions. Let's see if you have any questions. It takes a little while to type up your question. Okay, questions? Okay, would you say that culturally, US and Japan tend to be more high-low context on average? Okay, so yes, I want to emphasize that you don't want to stereotype, right? But that being said, there is a tendency, and US tends to be more low context because US is a United States of America melting pot. All kinds of immigrants from all over the world come to the US. So we often face so many different values, right? And different communication styles. So Americans have to be low context and explain everything very clearly and directly and explicitly. So US tends to be quite low context. Whereas Japan, what do you think? What do you think? Think about Mr. K. Quite high context. And in fact, according to Edward Hall's research, Japan is one of the most high context country in the whole world, which means if we are so used to the Japanese way or very high context way of communication, when we communicate with anyone around the world, we're going to face communication gap, right? Because we're the Japanese are the farthest to the high context side. So thinking about how to turn your messages into a little more low context can clarify your messages and you can convey your message a little more clearly. Yeah, high context, right. And there's a question about a story. How much can you put in that content when you talk about a story? So how much content meaning the length? Well, it depends on how long your presentation is, or whether you want to use your story as an opening story, or one story throughout your presentation, or a quick closing story. So it depends. And if you have to communicate with someone whom you are not familiar with, how do you analyze as you have little information of the person? Oh, yeah. So this analyze process is a trial and error. So it's not like you're sitting observing the other person, and you're taking notes, and then, okay, so this is how I'm analyzing, so I'm gonna respond this way. It doesn't happen like that, right? In a real world. So as you're communicating, you have your analysis tool in your head and quickly plot the other person and yourself. Where am I? Where is this person? And where is this gap? How big? And then you try to adapt in one direction. And if that's not spot on, then try again and try again. And as you do trial and error, you're starting to get the keen sense of how to adapt and how quickly you can adapt. So there is a trial and error process. It's not a one shot kind of analysis. And okay, so this is going to be the last question I'm going to answer. So do you have tips on how to communicate with the correct amount of info required to achieve the goal, but with maximum concision? I have trouble finding this balance, especially with executive communication, where I tend to over elaborate. In my mind, I'm providing valuable background context. Yeah. So how much information, right? Again, analysis. You need to be analyzing on the spot. And if you're working with your colleagues, or if it's your boss, you get to know the person little by little, more and more, day by day, right? So not only when you're presenting your idea to your boss, observe his or her regular tendencies in everyday conversation. And then you'll start to understand their tendencies. Does he like a lot of data or logic? Does he like more logic, or does he like more emotion? Then when you analyze that your boss on an everyday basis, then you will be able to guess um, how much content you need to present to the boss. But then your boss may have got out of the bed from the wrong side of the bed this morning, and maybe he's thinking, okay, cut to the chase today. So every day is different, right? So that's why I said the analysis is all relative, because every day, every situation, everyone, or your mood, they could shift on the scale. So you need to analyze every single time, with every person. Okay, well, thank you for the questions. So before the Q&A, I told you that there is a final A that completes the set, and it builds a firm foundation to exercise the 3 A's with maximum result. And that is, I'm trying to reveal the last A. Okay, so this was the story model. Here you go. So the last A, drum roll please, is attitude. Attitude. So I'm gonna stop sharing again. So let me take you back to 1993, quite long ago, when I first experienced a huge cross-cultural breakthrough. I was 21 years old, junior in college in Japan. I saw a flyer about an exchange program to the United States of America. A beautiful campus, happy students, and lots of sunshine. And I said to myself, that's my future. Here I come, St. Louis, Missouri. It's close to New York, right? On day one, the campus tour. The student tour guide was tall, muscular, kind of looked like Tom Cruise. Tom says, "Hey, what's up?" And me, up? Up. That's not in my dictionary. And here are Tom's hot girls going, OMG, seriously? She did not. I can't even. Americans speak so fast. I was lost. I felt different. I felt disconnected. One Friday night, my dorm hosted a party. Blasting music, beer bottles, pizza boxes all over the place. And drunk Americans talk even faster. That was the last place I wanted to be. I was rushing back to my room, and someone blocked my way. It was Nate, a surfer dude, long brown hair and sunglasses. I mean, really, sunglasses at night. Only a surfer dude in a landlocked Missouri. This Nate came up to me, grabbed my shoulder, and said, "Dude, don't be so antisocial." I was struggling to assimilate. I couldn't talk like them, act like them, or think like them. And I couldn't even understand them. I wanted to go home. I felt like a water-filled balloon ready to explode, and this Nate guy popped it. I burst into tears. What a party popper. But I squeezed out my last bit of courage to say, だって英語早いしわかんないし、頑張っても追いつかないし。Dude, my English is not good. Then Nate gave me words of wisdom that changed my life. Yeah, and he didn't care that my English was broken. He didn't care I look different. And he didn't care that I'm from a totally different culture. And then I finally realized I'm the only one refusing to embrace the differences. The last thing I expected was to get enlightened by a surfer dude. But his two little words and his sunglasses brought me back into the light. That's the attitude. Yes, and. So yes, and is often used in improv. It encourages you to listen and to be receptive to others' ideas rather than immediately judging the idea. But instead, you accept it and build upon it. Yes, and. The next day, for the first time, I left my door open. People popped in and said, "Hi, y'all." And well, here's an yes and. Yes. And I knocked on their doors and said, "Konnichiwa." Fast forward 31 years, and look at me now, dude. You may still detect a trace of Japanese accent, but yes, and perhaps your cross-cultural journey may be a little bit different. You may face differences, not only with your overseas clients or culturally diverse team, but with different departments, different generations, or different personalities. Before today, you might have said, "That's common sense." Before today, you might have judged, "They are wrong." But after today, you know what to do. Apply the 3 A's. It takes some trial and error. And if you find yourself caught in the layers of glasses, remember this one? Acknowledge the difference with curiosity. Analyze what's in that gap and adapt to find out how you can influence others. And if you get stuck in the process, remember the right attitude and say to yourself, yes, and. Well, thank you very much for listening today. And if you are interested in furthering your learning, I highly encourage you to get your copy of my newest book, Uncover Your One Big Message. Kindle version is also available on Amazon right now. And I can't wait to hear you present your ideas effectively, persuasively, and globally and locally. Thank you very much.